look in these two sessions at how the nations are making their preparation to come against God's people Israel. Like the coming of winter, we can see abundant signs that these things are coming to pass. We can see Russia's steps to move southward. We can see Britain being more and more isolated from the things of Europe. We can see the iron clay feet of the image being formed. We can see great changes in the Middle East, so that there is a king of the north, king of the south powers arising there. And these are wonderful signs to us, especially at a time when the ecclesias are under such pressure. Our young people are being pressured by the constant flow of information concerning evolution to try and see whether they can change their understanding of Genesis chapters 1 to 3 and try and adapt to the evolutionary ideas. And of course that is, one can't do it. We have to have strong faith in our God. The evidence is there. And just at a time when the ecclesias are suffering, God has given us all these wonderful signs so that we can see that his hand is at work. And it's a great privilege to have the Bible in our hands so that when we look out on a world and we're not frightened by it. The world is frightened by it. It sees great troubles, it sees terrorism, it sees earthquakes, it sees famines, it sees pestilences. But we know that the world is not going to end with Putin pressing the nuclear button. It's not going to end with Ebola sweeping the world like in the Middle Ages. We know the kingdom of God is going to come, and a great change of peace and blessing for the earth. A lot of these things we are very sheltered from in this country. Our brothers and sisters living in Africa are facing the great upset of Ebola. It has devastated the economies and everyday life because people can't go out and plant and sow, and they're very fearful of what is happening, and the situation there seems very dire. And there's a lot of brothers and sisters in Sierra Leone and Liberia. Nigeria at the moment has kept itself Ebola free. But this was a report estimating that there might be 90,000 deaths just in one county in Liberia by the middle of December. Interestingly, the graphs, the top line on the graph shows the total deaths from Ebola, and it does seem to have paused, but just at the fourth it's just beginning to go up again. And the latest report I could get, which was on last Sunday, showing that there was suddenly a sharp rise. And so it is a very fearful thing for them. What I want to say just before we get going a lot further is that the reading that we took about Daniel chapter 2 is a very important one, and it in fact holds together the two talks that we're giving. But so many things have just been happening in Ukraine and that I think we're not going to be able to look at the Daniel chapter 2 and see how it all fits in until the beginning of part 2. So don't worry too much if you're not seeing the scriptures being tied in this first part. I've had to push it to the beginning of the second part, and that will link our two halves together. And the other important point, which I always make, is that we're not going to be around when Gog comes down against Israel. We will have been called away to judgment quite a long time, I believe, before that. I think from scriptures we can have some guidance that there could be a 10-year period from our call to the Master, to judgment, to Sinai, to the nations coming down, and then Christ and the saints glorified and immortalised by that time, coming forth to redeem Israel from the hand of their enemies. And so there are many strands which we can see haven't quite reached their destination, as it were. The pieces of the jigsaw are still being moved by the angels, and they're not quite all there. But that doesn't mean to say that our calling isn't very imminent. I believe that the Master truly is at the door. The evidence for that is in Leviticus chapter 23 in verse 24-27. Let's just have a quick turn to that. It's based upon the law and the final festival in the law, Leviticus 23 and verse 24 is about, "Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, In the 7th month, in the 1st day of the month, ye shall have a Sabbath, a memorial of blowing of trumpets, and holy convocation, do no servile works." And then on the verse 27th, "On the 10th day of the 7th month, there shall be the Day of Atonement, a holy convocation afflicting your souls." Now, the blowing of the trumpets we associate with the resurrection. It could well be that encased in this laws here is an indication that the elders, the saints, are being called away with the trumpet resurrection in the 1st day of the month. And then on the 10th day of the month, it is the Day of Atonement for the nation of Israel, the time of their redemption from sin and troubles. And applying a day for a year, that would give us an indication of a 10-year period from our calling away to the saving of Israel from their enemies. And we know there are several passages which seem to indicate there's about a 40-year period from that time, from Armageddon, to the establishment of the kingdom. And most of that will be involved in matters to do with Europe, who will be resisting the return of the Lord Jesus. And obviously the kingdom has got to extend to the ends of the world during that 40-year period. And that then gives us a 50-year period, which is how God works. There's these Jubilee periods. Now, one question that often arises is, are we to look to Russia conquering Europe? Years ago, there were many talks and magazines and leaflets about Russia triumphant, Europe in chains. Well, I think that Revelation chapter 16, which is a chapter which we well know, indicates that that isn't the situation. We have a dragon power, which we equate with Russia. We have a beast power, which we associate with Germany and the EU, and we have a false prophet, which we equate with the papacy. And they keep their separate identities. We're living in the time of this period of a dragon, beast and false prophet. So we're not looking for Europe to be conquered by Russia. They keep their identities. At the moment there's great conflict between them because of the matters over Ukraine, which we'll be looking at. But the time will come when they will bury their differences, unite together, as Ezekiel 38 indicates, to come down against God's people of Israel. But there is one spot that we are expecting Russia to take, and that is Constantinople. Why do we say that? Well, it is rooted in history. There have been 3 Romes. There was the original Rome, where the emperors ruled over the Roman Empire. And then when Rome became Christian, in inverted commas, under Constantine, he moved the centre of government over to what he called Constantinople, rebuilt it after the pattern of Rome, and the empire was ruled from Constantinople. And that continued until 1453, when the Ottomans swept in and Constantinople fell. And then the things to do with the church and the emperor moved to Moscow, and Moscow was known then from that time onwards as the Third Rome. And it's very interesting when, with the fall of communism, that they adopted the old imperial emblem. That was an emblem that goes way back in time to the time of the Byzantine Empire, to Constantinople, double-headed, the emperor being in charge of military and religious matters, as well as looking east and west, as Constantinople did. It had influence over both halves of the Roman Empire. But this has been revived. Moscow is known as the Third Rome, and as we shall see, that Putin is eager to build Moscow as the Third Rome, but he also wants to come down against Constantinople to avenge the defeat. I know it's 600 years ago, but they have long memories in the psyche of the Russians. The defeat of 1453, when Constantinople fell, was a great blot in history, and they want to avenge it. Now, the importance of Ukraine, which is so much in the news, is that the Ukraine is the birthplace of the Russian Empire. We can go back in history, back to the time of the flood, or just after the time of the flood. Japheth had his many sons. His youngest son was Tyrus. And we believe that Tyrus emigrated to this region and left his name, the river Tirus, now called the Dniester, but it used to be called the river Tirus, and Terastopol still exists to this day, clearly from the name of Tyrus, that youngest son of Japheth. And Herodotus says that the people who first inhabited Crimea were called the Taurus, and you can see Taurus, not a mile difference. The interesting thing is that these people call themselves the Rus, or the Ross. And again, it's not too difficult to see, well, Tyrus, just truncate it, and you get the Rus, the Ross. This is the origin of Russia. This is where it all began. It reached its empireship, as it were. In the outline in blue is where Ukraine is today. But Kiev and Novgorod, two important towns, got together and established this empire with a succession of rulers. They carry on beyond that. This is just up to 1,000. And Igor there is considered by the Russians, this Dukes is a modern historian. Soviet historians look upon Igor as the true beginning of the Russian princely line. So the Russians see their origin from Kiev, from this empire that was set up there. And Vladimir, the last one on this particular list, is also important to them, because Vladimir was the first to adopt Christianity. He married the emperor's sister at Constantinople, and the agreement was, well, you can marry my sister as long as you convert to Christianity. And so he was baptised. I understand it was a total immersion in those days. He was baptised and married on the same day, and he and his new wife took back Christianity to Kiev, and it flourished there. Now, as time went on, the empire expanded, but then the Mongols swept in 1240 and drove them out from the Ukraine, and Kiev was taken by them. And eventually the things of Kiev were transferred to Moscow, so the church, which became the Russian Orthodox Church, became established in Moscow in 1322. And that led the way when, 100 years later, Constantinople fell, that would then become the centre of Orthodox religion. And it wasn't until 1654 that Ukraine got reattached back to the Russian Empire. And just exactly 60 years ago, this year, there were great celebrations in the Ukraine about this anniversary, this 300th anniversary from 1654, this treaty which bound them back together again. And there's a picture of a Ukrainian and a Russian eternally together. Now, what is of great interest to us for what is happening now is that Khrushchev, who was the Russian leader at the time, gave Crimea to Ukraine as a present to celebrate this anniversary. It didn't make a lot of difference because they were all under the Soviet control, but that was what happened. Crimea was transferred from the Soviet to the control of the Ukrainians. And then 24 years later, after that anniversary, was the anniversary of the 1000th year from when Christianity came to Russia. And this is from a Christian history book. There's a front cover in 1988 showing the people of Kiev being baptized, immersed into water, when Christianity came there. And it was quite interesting how it just summed up. This is a very brief extract from quite a long article in that magazine. It's finally come, the observance that millions of Ukrainian, Belarusian and Russian Christians have been waiting for, the millennium of the Christianization of Rus. But the arrival and celebration of this millennium is heavily laden with irony. The Soviet Union, a zealously atheistic government, is endorsing, even funding and promoting, the most spectacular of the many events worldwide that are being dedicated to this millennium of Christianity in Rus. And it was truly a remarkable thing that here Soviets been suppressing Christianity for 900 years, suddenly entering into the spirit of this 1000th anniversary. And of course nobody realised in 1988 that we were so close to the fall of the Soviets. It was only 3 years later, in 1991, that the Soviet broke up. And all the nations in these colours here separated themselves from Russia and gained their independence. Now, to the Russian people, that again was a disastrous thing. Putin, way back when he was first president, said that the demise of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. I was talking about the 20th century. And we had 2 world wars, but no, the breakup of the Soviet was the greatest catastrophe because she suddenly lost a lot of her possessions. Now, Putin regards these former colonies as being very much part of Russia and is very much against the West, as the West is trying to pull them towards the EU. So bitter conflict, and we see the seeds of it. Now we just want to concentrate on the Ukraine. Most of the trouble in the Ukraine is in the eastern region. This is the quite a wealthy region. This is where the coal mining is at Donetsk, and it is the industrial heartland. In fact, quite a high proportion of the Ukrainians live in the east. Now, if I superimpose upon that map this, which tells us of the percentage of Russian-speaking people in Ukraine, you can see why this eastern part, with 87%, 82% are Russian-speaking, tailing right off to only 3% in the west there. You can see why the eastern side has such kinship with Russia rather than with the west. And Putin is very keen, at least, to take in this eastern and southeastern section under Russian hands. We know that in March of this year he moved in and seized Crimea. Crimea is very important to Russia because this is where they have their big fleet. But at the moment they haven't got much access to it, only by ship, because the only land access runs through Ukraine, which of course they are denied. So at the moment what they're looking at is calling in the Chinese to build a bridge across that very little narrow waterway there, which will connect Russia mainland to Crimea. But as I say, the importance to Russia of taking Crimea was she had then control of her bases at Sevastopol. Now Russia has many naval bases, but the problem with all of her bases is that in winter time they get frozen up, apart from Sevastopol in the Black Sea. So this is an ice-free port, a deep port. It can take deep ships, and what she is aiming to do is to enlarge her navy at Crimea. The other prize for Russia in taking Crimea was that it suddenly gave her access to a lot more of the maritime coastline, because this, in this particular shade, used to be Ukrainian. Now Russia says, well, we now possess Crimea, so we have access, maritime access to all that region. Now the importance of that is that off the coast here is vast oil and gas reserves. It's been likened to the North Sea, and so we can see how important it is for Russia to have control over that region there. Now Putin, as we said, is modelling himself upon the old things. He sees himself as one of the Tsars, one of the emperors of Russia, and he believes is resurrecting the Third Holy Roman Empire. As Putin slowly expands the borders of the Russian Federation and recovers ancient territory of Imperial Russia, he believes he's expanding the Third Holy Roman Empire. He frequently talks of his faith. And here's another one. Putin cast himself as an ideal new Russian leader, both of church and state. Putin has skillfully crafted a sense of Russian identity in the post-communist world by adeptly appealing to the sense of nationhood based upon orthodoxy, autocracy, and good old Tsarist, and indeed Roman imperial masculine ideals. And in this he is backed by the church. And it was quite interesting that the Russian Orthodox leader, the Patriarch, he agrees that Ukraine, in principle, does not independently exist. Ukraine is instead part of the historical territory of Russia. So here we have Putin, backed by his church, saying of Ukraine, really, this is part of Russia. Because after all, this is where Russia originated from. And we have seen a remarkable growth in the church and its power since 1991. There are frequent pictures of Putin and other leaders with the religious leaders. There's virtually no political gathering where there isn't a priest standing by or the patriarch. And again, at all religious ceremonies, there will be the political leaders. Church and state are intertwined, and that is remarkable considering the short period of time in which Christianity has been allowed to flourish. And this Russian Orthodox Metropolitan Heralion will be coming back to this slide later on in a different context. But he gave an interesting speech, and he was outlining just the incredible growth. Throughout the last 26 years, the Russian Church opened more than 26,000 churches, 1,000 churches a year, 3 churches every day. More than 800 monasteries, which have been filled with young monks and nuns. A whole generation of people torn from the church has again discovered faith. So that's quite staggering. Now we believe that Putin is working to a master plan. He knows what he's doing. He has pre-planned his steps. And in order to do so, he has to make Russia a military threat. And just at a time when the West, America, is getting rid of nuclear missiles, Russia is busy building them. In fact, she now has more nuclear missiles than America has. But here he is Russia is to increase annual spending on nuclear weapons by more than 50% in the next 3 years, and the draft federal budget provides for a 60% increase in overall national defence spending by 2016. Russia is currently in the midst of its biggest rearmament drive for a generation, part of a massive overhaul of the forces, including a move towards all professional services. So Putin is preparing for war. And we can see Putin's pathway to the south. Back in 2008, when everybody's eyes were on the Olympic Games, he marched his troops into Georgia and carved out 3 enclaves. The top 2 are very important because these are the crossing points, because of the Caucasus Mountains which run up the back there. There is an entry point there and the entry points up there. Now she has control of those and also an exit one there. And it wouldn't take Russian army very long to just link those 2 up when they decide to. So that was 2008. So quite a time ago, 6 years ago, but Putin is moving. That was his first move. And then this year he seizes Crimea. He is in Ukraine, causing trouble on the eastern section there. And he has also, on the other side of the Ukraine, he has enlarged the military airfield there to take the big military transporter planes. He's also put 2,000 troops into Moldova, as well as having 3,000 upwards of troops in eastern Ukraine. So you can see how he's seized the south and he's pinching east and west, as it were. He's building up his navy at Sevastopol. Again, we will look in more detail at that in a moment. And he is stepping up his military naval patrols in the eastern Mediterranean. Now, Putin has unswervingly supported President Assad in Syria. And knowing what his future plans are, we can see why. Because he needs to have a friend in that territory there. And he also has been supporting Iran. And just this last 3 days, he has upset the West. America is negotiating with Iran over its nuclear capabilities, or its centrifuges. And Putin has come along to the Iranians and signed an agreement which will see that the Russians build 2 more nuclear power stations in Iran, and potentially another 4. And what they have said, and this is what has upset the West, is that, right, we'll be supplying the fuel rods to drive these, but in the future, you're quite capable of supplying your own fuel rods. You have got all these centrifuges, which, of course, Israel is very unhappy about because they can be used to build nuclear bombs with modification. So we can see that Russia is looking after her friends. She's got 2 friends which she's prepared to support in spite of all the problems, all the sanctions that are put upon her. So she has come up steps there. And then just a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago was it, was revealed that the Syrian Free Army, who's been fighting in the region there, came across a Russian listening post spying on Israel. So there's the Sea of Galilee, this is the Golan Heights, and on this hill there, Al-Hara, they came across, they seized the Syrian Free Army, seized this post, and inside they found all these pictures of Russians and Russian people who had been manning it and visiting it. And clearly it was an advanced post of the Russians, which they've now lost to the Free Syrians, which was being used to spy upon Israel and Israel's movements and messages there. So we can see how he is making his preparation to move forward. And he certainly knows where he is going. He's working to a plan. So just going back to Ukraine and Crimea, as we say, Sevastopol is this deep water, ice-free port. When he seized Crimea, he also seized the Ukrainian ships, which also were had their own base very near to Sevastopol. And in fact, Putin seized, the Russians under his control, seized 51 of the Ukrainian naval vessels. And most of the people on board these ships have decided to switch sides and to join the Russian Navy. Their pay is better and they have a job, whereas if they refuse, then they've lost their job. So suddenly he has enlarged his fleet of ships by another 51 ships. So it's not quite doubled the size of his navy there, but not far off. But he's also taken the step, and this again is what worries the West, is to station on Crimea these nuclear missiles. These Iskanders are one of the most advanced missile systems available, and so he's putting these missiles in Crimea, nuclear tipped. He is also putting in his Air Force a squadron of these Tu-22 supersonic fighting planes, which again are adapted when necessary to carry nuclear bombs. Just earlier this week ago, the Russian shipyard in Kaliningrad launched the second of these frigates. There's a total of 6 are on order, and these frigates are to be based here. So we can see the great preparations. There's also quite a programme to build nuclear-powered submarines, which again will be based here. You can see a sudden concentration of missiles, weaponry in Crimea. What is that for? Well, we know what that is for. It's all part of his plan to move further south. So the statement here, the stationing of new nuclear forces on the Crimean Peninsula is both a new and threatening, a menacing threat to the security of Europe, and also a clear message from Putin that he intends to continue to violate the territorial integrity of his neighbours. Well, the situation in eastern Ukraine is that these two provinces, Luhansk and Donetsk, I doubt if that's how they're pronounced, but at the moment about a third of the total territory is under Russian control. They had elections at the beginning of the month, and they all agreed, yes, we will be independent. Just at the moment, there is quite an interest to push southwards to this little port which is on the coast of Mariupol. As I said, Donetsk is the coal mining region, and they don't have any outlet other than going into Russia for their coal. So what they're very keen to do is to take that port, and at that port is the main Ukrainian steel yards, where they've got steel furnaces and that. And it is an important port, because from there it's not too far to get to Crimea and out through the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. So the writing is on the wall for Mariupol to be seized, and there is at the moment sporadic fighting, and the Ukrainians are very fearful that that is going to fall. And don't expect it would stop there. One would expect, if I just go to the next slide, this is how it was over 100 years ago. This is in 1897. And the region we're just looking at there, and the port's just about there. But in 1897, this was known as New Russia. And this is the term that the Russians are using of their enclave in this region up here. They're talking about it as the New Russia, Nova Russia. And you can see that, well, this is where the Russian-speaking population live. Take that region, and then they've got their access by land to Crimea. It might happen fairly soon. This was Wednesday. Is Putin about to invade Ukraine? Observers report a huge build-up of Russian military forces on Ukraine's borders, about 7,000 or more troops inside Ukraine, and some 50,000 massing outside. Besides scores of howitzers, rocket launchers and armoured vehicles, the estimates estimate 100 tanks inside and another 400 tanks outside the porous border. You could call it an escalation. The invasion began with Crimea and moved to Donbass and hasn't stopped still. Actually, we're witnessing preparation for outright war. And this was a comment on Friday that the Ukraine ambassador to the EU has warned Brussels that Russia is preparing a new full-scale offensive operation in Ukraine. You see, Crimea was stage 1, into eastern Ukraine was step 2. To take more of it is his next step. And his longer term plan is not to stop there. Even the world can see the message. This is Russia's push to the south. Moscow's conquest and annexation of Crimea in February has set the stage for a new Russian drive to the south. Furthermore, the Russian naval presence in the Black Sea, as well as Moscow's acquisition of new naval bases and infrastructure in the strategic region, all directly threaten Turkey, the other major local naval power of the Black Sea. And there is trouble brewing, because on Sunday, or probably on Saturday, reported on Sunday, about this fiery telephone call between the president of Turkey and Putin. The pugnacious Turkish president made a rare telephone call to his Russian counterpart to discuss the latest regional developments, particularly Syria's raging conflict. To Erdogan's surprise, Putin was infuriated and vehemently warned the Turkish president from further interfering in Syrian internal affairs. Otherwise, Russia is ready to thwart Turkey from triggering a catastrophic war in the region. The Turkish flabbergasted president then asked Putin whether his fiery remarks meant a direct threat against Turkey. And Putin replied, "Mr. President, you may construe whatever interpretations you wish from my words." Now, knowing Putin, we don't have much difficulty in seeing the implication. He was saying to Turkey, keep out of interfering in Syria because the Turks want to see Assad gone. Putin needs Assad there as his forward base. And he was saying to Turkey, keep out, otherwise we will take action. Now, this may be some way off. We went from 2008 in Georgia to 2014, so it may be some way off. It may belong to the period when we're at Sinai that Russia finally sweeps down against Turkey. But there's no doubt that Turkey is the destination, the ultimate destination. As one goes to Russia, especially Moscow, you see the cross over the crescent, and they will openly tell you, well, it's pointing to the time when the cross will be triumphant over the Turkish crescent, so avenging the fall of Constantinople. Now, back in World War I, Russia did try to take Constantinople Istanbul today, but it failed because it wasn't in God's plan. The time hadn't come. But we can be sure that the next time will be the right time, and Turkey will fall to Russia. So we are in a grim time, and Russia, Putin, is not afraid to threaten the world with his use of nuclear weapons if necessary. This comment in the International Business Times: to make a joke about a nuclear war threat is no laughing matter at all. More so if it's been uttered at least 3 times in less than 2 months. And again, Russian President Vladimir Putin may not really be kidding at all every time he reminds the West of his country's nuclear arsenal. And Gorbachev said, didn't he, the world is on the brink of a new Cold War. Those of the Telegraph, that was a centre spread there, a new Cold War. So, at the moment, the contest is over Ukraine. Now, we might, from what news we read in the West, think it is all a very one-sided affair, and this is all Russia clawing away. But that isn't the fact at all. The EU has been goading Russia very much in the past year or so. And without our understanding from history of the importance of Ukraine to Russia, we might wonder, just why Russia was so important. But we know this was where it began, and we know it is an important stepping stone on her way southward. Now, Merkel has been very prominent in the EU seeking to draw Ukraine to the West. And there was an interesting article a couple of months ago. The EU claims that it has put about 25 million into Ukrainian civil societies over quite a long time period, about 6, 7, 8, 9 years, isn't it? In actual fact, the amount of money that the EU has poured into Ukraine in an effort to make it turn to the West is actually not to £25 million, but 348 million. And Merkel and the other high-ranking EU officials were very prominent a year ago, trying to turn the president, who was president at the time, who was very Russian-leaning, trying to drag Ukraine to the West. They didn't succeed. The President Yanukovych stepped down, didn't he? It was in February time. But it has left this bitterness on Russia's part that the West has been interfering in Ukraine, trying to pull it westward, and it says no, it belongs to us. And so we see that the West is a bit impotent. Russia has all the cards. The West might put sanctions on Russia, but those sanctions are backfiring, aren't they, on the West. Germany has lost an awful lot of trade because Germany was one of the prime sources of trade for Russia. And because of the sanctions, that trade isn't there. She's experienced a real slump, as is all the EU. And it may be sufficient to tilt the balance and cause a collapse of the euro. And if what seems to be the situation that very imminently Putin is going to go further into Ukraine, and the West try to put more sanctions on, it will only affect them very badly. We can see from Putin's viewpoint it's a brilliant time to go and make trouble in Ukraine, because the EU has had all new elections, there are new commissioners at the beginning of the month taking their offices, settling into their jobs. America is occupied with ISIS in the Middle East, And now Al-Qaeda have joined up with ISIS, making the job even more difficult. As I say, for timing, it would be a brilliant time for Russia to move forward. And I think today, Cameron in Australia at the G20 meeting is going to have strong words with Putin, but they will roll off his back. Interestingly, the change in what is called the representative for the EU Union of Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, what we will call our Foreign Minister, has now changed. Catherine Ashton now has stepped down and been replaced by this much younger lady who was the Italian Minister of Foreign Affairs. And she is quite pally with Putin. This was a cartoon earlier on. And so it will make it more difficult for the EU to stand up to Russia if their foreign minister is friendly with him. Interesting time ahead. Now, just continuing our look at the EU, we've morphed seamlessly from Ukraine and Russia, the EU. Forbes has just issued its list of what they regard as the world's most powerful people, and the first 5 haven't changed from last year, beginning with Putin. But what is of interest to us is Merkel is still in number 5. She is regarded as the most powerful woman in the world. There are a few business peoples at number 8. You might not recognise that face. That's Mario Draghi, who's the President of the European Central Bank, and so therefore holds the most important role. And Cameron was in 11th place last year. He has stepped up a place to number 10. So Merkel is considered the most powerful woman in the world, and Germany is certainly the undoubted leader of the EU. There have been some very interesting articles, again that were only this week, indicating that in Germany there is a movement away from Germany feeling responsible for what happened in World War II, and no longer is she going to take much cognizance of what happened then. She is determined, the past is the past, we've atoned for our sins, as it were, we've got to move forward. And so that will be part of a growing in Germany's leadership. She's put the past behind her and is pressing forward. Now everybody looks to Mrs. Merkel to deal with Putin. 2 reasons. One, that she grew up in Eastern Germany and so can speak fluent Russian, just as Putin was a spy in Eastern Germany and therefore can speak fluent German. So she's the one who understands Putin, has had a lot to do with Putin, has visited Putin, spent Christmases with Putin, and she is in this awkward position now because of what Putin is doing. She is being pushed by other people to put sanctions upon Putin, which I think basically she is reluctant to do. Interestingly, they've just had the 25th celebration of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and Merkel was one of those that first evening who went from East Germany across into West Germany on that first night when they were able to cross without being shot at. So strong links she has with Eastern Germany and with Russia. There is an interesting movement again in Russia to have an emperor, not necessarily to lead the people, but to be a figurehead. And this was an interview back in June of last year of the great grandson of the last Kaiser, who said, you know, this is what Germany needs. We need somebody to withstand the onslaught of moral degradation which is taking place. We see it in this country, it's taking place around the world. We need somebody to be an example to the German people, figurehead. He believed that a royal family with divine right conferred by God could offer Germany what is missing. And indeed, this appears to be what increasingly amounts of young Germans want. 1 in 3 18 to 24-year-olds would like the Kaiser back on the throne, whereas the older generation, that drops to 1 in 6. Could well be that there is a reinstatement of the Kaiser. And there is a similar movement in Russia. We haven't looked at it, but we've looked at it in the past. The heir to the Romanov throne, a young man, Georgi, he's about 32 now, would quite like to have the monarchy restored in Russia. Maybe we shall see the eagles in 2 camps. But Germany is setting up an embryo. We mustn't call it a European army because that upsets the British. We have to call it a mutual military liaison organisation. And she's doing that with Poland, which is one of the biggest countries, and the other is little Netherlands on the other side there. And what is happening, Germany and the Polish and the Netherlands people are exchanging troops. Germany is the dominant power, so there are German commanders in Poland and in the Netherlands. The Polish are equipped mainly with German Leopard tanks, so they're quite used to working with them. But one can see that when Britain eventually gets kicked out, that this will grow into Germany leading the bringing together of an army, having a military might, in order that in this future day, when Gog comes down with his many companions, that there is an EU army to join with the Russian army to come down against Israel. So Britain is increasingly being isolated. I'm not going to read the headlines, just run through them, these are some of them. And the EU Parliament in May shows an increasingly sceptical Europe, and Britain finds herself alienated from many of the things that Brussels wants to impose. And we know a fortnight ago how, a bit longer, 3 weeks ago, wasn't it, when there was this sudden demand, seemingly out of the blue, of Britain's got to pay $1.7 billion into the EU funds by December the 1st. And now, if that wasn't bad enough, it was that France was going to get a very generous rebate, and so was Germany. And Britain, because she'd kept outside the EU and had prospered, here she was being clobbered with this big bill, and we know how Cameron says, I'm not going to pay. Now they've come up with a compromise, but it was a very shallow compromise, because it's been cut in half, only by reason of bringing forward a rebate which Britain would have had in any case at the end of next year, bringing that forward. So it's a very weak victory. And one can say that they really do know how to drive Britain away. And Merkel was saying, wasn't she, that, well, if Britain insists on limiting immigration, well, we'll wave goodbye to you, because that goes so counter to the spirit of the EU. And Cameron's being pushed. Now, when we go back in our Bibles, back to Daniel chapter 10, we have a record there of the angel Gabriel saying he's having problems in causing the Prince of Greece going the way he wanted. And today it must be exactly the same for the angels. Cameron's natural inclination is to reform the EU but remain in it. But God's got a different plan for Britain outside the EU, and is finding himself pushed, and Farage and Merkel on the other side are making them go in paths that he doesn't necessarily want to go. But you see, we know the angels will succeed. And, you know, the British are a bit fearful. Well, how can we live outside the EU? Well, take our minds back to the children of Israel in Egypt. They must have had very similar thoughts. If we leave all this security and go out into a wilderness, you know, what will happen to us? It took many efforts of the angels, didn't it? Many plagues that came along before they were driven out, and they found that actually, yes, with God's good hand, they were able to survive. So it is interesting how Britain has suddenly begun to prosper. After years and years of being the sick man of Europe, and Europe seemingly prospering within the euro, many business people in Britain saying, well, you know, we should have joined the euro and enjoyed all this prosperity. When suddenly, of course, the euro collapsed, and Britain has found that, well, actually, she's doing quite well outside. She's attracting a lot of inward investment. She is growing when the others, their economies are shrinking. Britain is working very much with Israel. Her trade with Israel has gone up about 16% this year compared with last year. She's also working very much in the Middle East. These are two centres that we've been looking for a long time. So, you know, in a wonderful way, we can see the hand of God working on Britain so that she will remove herself or be kicked out eventually from the EU, because Britain's role is to be on the side of the King of the South, as we shall see in our second part. She is not part of that confederation of nations that come against Israel. That's why it's so wonderful to see under Cameron that Britain has been so keen to build up her trade with Israel. Well, we'll leave it there, and as I say, we'll begin the next part by looking at Daniel chapter 2 and see how we can see the feet forming, and in the events that we've been looking at, we see the feet forming. But in another aspect of the Daniel's image, we can see being foretold the events which are taking place in the Middle East, with this division between the north and the south of the Middle East. And so, you know, it is really such wonderful, exciting times, brothers and sisters. Thank you.